A ragged old lady like you? What money could you possibly have to lose?" The cop sneered, his hand already deep in Mrs. Mabel's coat pocket like he was searching for keys to a bargain bin safe. What he didn't know was that the woman he treated like social debris was the mother of a man who once wiped out an entire insurgent training camp in 7 minutes and 32 seconds. No gun, just a command. And this time that command was personal. No jet, no radar, just justice. Quiet but absolute. What state do you live in? Because this could be your local news. The midday sun poured down on the small town like a mute reminder that this place had never truly offered shade to anyone without a white coat or a legal awning to stand under. Mabel Johnson, 76 years old, black with frail bones but eyes still sharp, stood quietly before the frosted glass window of the Pension Distribution Center. "She waited longer than usual because the system was running slow," said the young clerk. But she didn't Slowness didn't strike her as odd. What struck her as odd were the rare moments of speed, the rare moments when she was greeted by name, with direct eye contact, instead of that woman. She stepped out of the office with her old cloth bag worn thin at the straps, inside it 6 green bills, $300 on the front side, $300 on the back, enough to pay the electricity bill, arthritis meds, and, if lucky, a loaf of bread not pulled from the clearance bin. Her soft-soled shoes made a sound as light as a shallow breath on the cracked asphalt. She didn't look around, didn't rush, didn't walk straight, but moved as if listening for something from the ground. Where years ago she had once knelt to pick up her husband's fallen sandals after a wrongful police frisk. Everyone in town knew Mabel, not because she was loud, not because she was famous, but because she was always present where no one paid attention. The laundromat on the corner, the Sunday flea market, the church's free medicine counter. She existed like a silent shadow, the kind of presence people only notice once it's gone. That day, just 5 minutes after leaving the pension office, she was stopped. A police car screeched to a halt by the curb, a cloud of dust rising like a splash of filth thrown in her face. A tall officer with buzz-cut blonde hair stepped out, walking like someone used to closing in on a target. Brent Lasker. No need to name him around here. There was only one guy who stopped old folks for a quick routine check. He didn't greet her, didn't smile. He simply raised his hand as if slicing through her thoughts and motioned for her to stop. "Where are you headed?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried just enough weight to be heard by those nearby without them realizing what they'd heard. Mabel didn't answer immediately. She paused, turned her face toward him like she was deciding whether he was really asking or just reenacting a tired old scene. "Going home," she replied. Clear enough to avoid being accused of evasion, but soft enough not to invite others into the conversation. "What's in the bag?" Lasker asked, and without waiting for a response, stepped forward and reached out like that bag was evidence that didn't need a warrant. Mabel stepped back, not from fear, but from the reflexes of someone long accustomed to dodging before being touched. But she knew she couldn't dodge for long. No one could dodge for long here. Not when the other person carried a gun and the law. He opened the bag, his hands quicker than thought. The 6 green bills appeared, neatly clipped inside a transparent plastic sleeve. He pulled them out, held them up like he'd just discovered contraband. "Why would someone like you need this much money? At your age, what can you buy besides cheap liquor?" he said, eyes not on the cash but locked onto her face, like he was waiting for a reaction. A tear, a plea, anything to give him a reason to go further. But there was nothing. Mabel stood there, spine straight like a dry branch that refused to bend, eyes unblinking, lips pressed, as if holding back a curse not meant for young ears. Lasker clicked his tongue, shoved the cash into his uniform pocket. "I'll hold this for verification. You know, lots of folks who look like you carry dirty money to buy oxygen." He turned away, climbed into the car, and the rear tires tore at the pavement. The car left, dust rose. Mabel stood, not from shock, not from anger, but because she was listening. To the tires, to the lightness of her bag, to her hand, now clenched, her nails cutting into her palm. A drop of blood welled, not from pain, but because her skin was thin enough now that even a whisper could tear it. No one stopped to ask. A few people passed. A mother hurried her child across the street. A young man glanced over, then pretended to take a call. No one turned, no one paused. No one wanted to confront a scene they'd seen too many times to still be moved. Mabel understood. She didn't blame them. She had once been them. Young, invisible, in a rush. But now she had nothing left to rush for. Nothing left to run from. Nothing much left to protect, except silence. And for someone who had lived long enough to understand that not every pain needs to be shouted, silence was sometimes the only way to make it last longer than any scream. She walked on, this time a little slower, not because of age, but because her bag was $600 lighter. No one saw it but her. But to her it wasn't just money. It was proof that she was still being noticed, and because of that she knew. She couldn't call the police. The police had taken it. She couldn't call the city council. They had once laughed when she complained about an unlocked garbage bin in the subsidized housing block. She couldn't call a lawyer. She didn't have the number. She had only one person left, one name she hadn't said aloud in nearly 10 years. The only one who had ever told her something she never forgot. If one day someone lays a hand on you, don't scream. Write to me. When Mabel stepped into the old wooden house, tucked behind a row of rotting fences, where the paint had washed away like memories fading through too many unshielded rainy seasons, the sunlight piercing the tin roof cast a pale reflection across the floor, throwing a faint golden streak onto the worn dining table, a dividing line between things that had happened and things that could never return. She took off her shoes, placed the bag on the table, and pulled from a small drawer next to the stove a crumpled brown envelope which contained no money, no important documents, only a fountain pen with a scratched silver cap, its blue ink half full, and a single large sheet of blank paper. Mabel sat down, back straight, wrists trembling, not from age, but because this feeling had long since gone dormant, the feeling of someone about to do something irreversible. She set the pen on the paper, pulled it toward her as if retrieving a piece of the past no one had asked about. The house was silent, save for the steady ticking of a wall clock that lost 1 minute each week, and the breeze sneaking through a window that never shut properly. Mabel began with soft strokes, not the careful lines of a formal petition, nor the hurried scrawl of a message to someone leaving soon. She wrote to someone she knew would read it, not out of politeness, not out of duty, but because between them, despite nearly a decade of silence, there remained a thread no one dared cut, a thread spun from a mother's tears and the unannounced blood of a son. She didn't write a date or return address. The one who needed to read it would understand. Those who didn't understand had no right to know. She began, "Today they took $600 from me. But what they took wasn't money." Her hand paused for a few seconds, not to think, but to listen, inwardly, to the words long left unspoken, now spilling from the pen as if her blood vessels had just been unlocked. They didn't take it by force. They didn't have to. They just stood there, as if they embodied something greater, like that system you once warned me about. Don't call when it touches you. The wind outside pushed in again, carrying a little dust across the floor that drifted over the page. Mabel gently smoothed the edge of the paper, holding on to the calm she knew wouldn't last long. She continued, "I know you didn't leave because you hated this place, but because you couldn't bear to live one more day without doing something that would break my heart. I knew the day you put on that uniform, I lost the right to call you mine, because from that moment, you were no longer only my son. You were someone trained to fight, and I only ever wanted you to survive." The pen strokes grew heavier, more consistent, each line perfectly straight, as if her hand had been waiting for this moment for a long time. "I haven't called you all these years, not because I forgot, but because I remembered too clearly. I feared that if I called, you would return, and if you returned, no one would leave unharmed." Her hand stopped there, not because she had nothing more to say, but to breathe, to keep her anger from writing for her. Mabel closed her eyes. In the darkness beneath her lids, she saw again the boy with eyes so cold that his elementary teacher once said, "He shouldn't be in a class with other kids. He looks like an adult who survived war." But Malik was only 8 years old then, and Mabel had never once raised her voice at him, only taught him how to stay silent at the right moment. And now she needed to relearn that from her son. She opened her eyes and continued writing. "You once told me, if anyone lays a hand on me, don't scream, write. So now I'm writing, not for you to get the money back, but so you know, I've stayed silent for the last time. From here on, whatever you choose to do, I won't stop you. But I hope you remain the man your father once believed you were, the one who could keep his conscience, even when his hands were stained with blood." Her hand no longer trembled. She placed the final period like closing a door that had no latch. The late afternoon light began to shift, slanting through the broken-hinged wooden window, casting fragmented beams over the letter like whispers from the departed. She folded the letter in thirds, slid it into the envelope, and left it unsealed. Just placed it on the table, staring at it for a long time, as if it had become her roommate, her witness, the one who would speak for her in a world that had no space for those without a priority card. On the envelope, she didn't write the recipient's name. She only wrote one line, "You know this place." Then she stood up, pulled an old scarf over her head, and left the house like someone who had just finished a private ritual, needing no witness, no bell. And in that empty house, all that remained was a sheet of paper, now filled with ink, a fountain pen lying on its side, and something unspoken, a thing only those who have lived their whole lives without shouting can understand, that silence, sometimes, is the loudest scream of all. At the exact moment the nameless letter was left on the old wooden table in a small house where light slanted awkwardly through the warped window frame, more than 12,000 kilometers away, in a military compound encoded with a string of digits no outsider could recall, a man sat silently in front of his screen, black as desert night. No letter had arrived. No alarm had gone off. No one had knocked or reported. Only a message appeared in coded format. Personal theater. Encryption 412. Urgent. Malik Johnson did not ask for clarification. He never asked twice. For people like him, questions were a form of delay, and in the system he operated within, delay was sometimes a uniformed death. Malik activated the internal protocol. Layered encryption, broke through the front nut firewall, and within 8.7 seconds accessed a PDF file sent from an address with no clearance to deliver military data. But it had passed through 3 firewalls. That alone was reason enough not to ignore it. When he opened the file, there was only a single scanned letter. Blue ink faded. The paper wrinkled with a smudge in the corner that might have been a fingerprint or a tear. He read it without blinking, not because he was captivating, but because his body had been trained to process full streams of data in a stillness where time did not exist. The handwriting was familiar, the tone is unmistakable, but no familiarity hurt more than the line, "I didn't call the police. I called you." And then, as if a reflex long buried had resurfaced, his hand folded the keyboard gently, pulled the security card from the terminal, shut down all power, and stepped out of the strategy module without making a sound. The base was buried deep in the desert, where daytime heat could melt sand into glass and nighttime cold could make old scars tremble. Malik walked through long corridors lit by dull, steel-colored lights, where every person in uniform walked quickly but never ran, spoke briefly but never lingered. He passed a lieutenant colonel in command. No one saluted, no one dared meet his eyes, not out of fear, but because they knew some people only appeared when something terrible had already happened or was about to. and Malik was one of those people, codenamed Echo 1, granted independent operational authority beyond campaign approval. In internal files, he had once led a team of only 2 into an illegal control center on the northern Syrian border and extracted full biometric data from an organization NATO had spent 7 years trying, and failing, to crack. No one knew how he did it. They only knew no injuries, no gunfire, no missing personnel from his team. Only Malik, always returning, always on time, and never leaving a word behind. When he entered Strategic Combat Room 1, where every deployment required full clearance, Malik spoke only one sentence to the military supervisor. "I need to leave my post. Emergency." The man looked up. Under what authority? Malik did not pull out documentation. Instead, he removed from his pocket a special badge, one sealed for cases involving personal matters with the potential to trigger national security consequences. The badge bore the code Red 0, issued only to veterans who had saved at least 10 lives abroad, without support from a home base. Malik had been granted that designation after the Phnom Penh incident in 2015. No one questioned him after that. The officer merely nodded, marked the record as temporarily withdrawn from duty, reason, protection of Category 1 national asset. No one asked what that asset was. They didn't dare. Malik boarded the first outgoing flight from the base, with no declared destination. The plane carried a few passengers, all coordinators, advisors, or individuals whose names were not to appear on official manifests. He looked at no one, spoke to no one, slept not a second. For 12 straight hours in transit, he sat like a bronze statue, hands clasped, head lowered slightly. But behind that stillness was a body trained to read the scent of blood on the wind, to identify targets in darkness, to endure even in the face of betrayal, and to wait, never acting until everything was clear as a dagger in his palm. He did not react to the insult. He did not flinch under pressure. But there was one thing that could pull him from a battlefield without awaiting orders: when someone laid hands on what must never be touched, his mother. When the plane landed at the civilian airport in the state where he was born, Malik didn't call a taxi, didn't rent a car, didn't contact anyone. He walked out of the main terminal and into a run-down roadside convenience store, where the shopkeeper had once been a friend of his father, a man who died when Malik was 13 in an Asokayat hunting accident no one ever investigated properly. The old man behind the counter recognized Malik the moment he saw the scar on his left wrist, the only mark Malik had never erased, though he had been offered to. He asked no questions, just nodded, then handed Malik the keys to a small truck parked outside, along with a slip of paper bearing Malik's most recent address, because she had moved after a stroke 5 years prior. When Malik sat in the driver's seat, the engine didn't start immediately. He gripped the steering wheel, closed his eyes, and inhaled deeply as if reacquainting himself with the scent of memory, a scent buried under layers of sand, blood, deployment orders, and the shallow breathing beside fallen brothers. In his mind, his mother's voice returned, not in words, but in glances, in the way she folded hand towels. In every morning she stood by the door and said nothing when he left, and now he was back. Not as a son coming home, but as a man awakened by a voice that did not need to shout, a letter without a name that still told the entire world. Someone had made a mistake. They wouldn't be allowed to make twice. As Malik turned the wheel onto the old road that led back to town, a light rain had just begun to fall. The kind of early-season rain that wasn't strong enough to wet the pavement, but dulled the colors, as if the sky itself was dimming to make room for an unnamed return. He didn't play music, nor did he roll up the window. The sound of the tires gliding over aged asphalt echoed like combat boots on concrete. Steady, indifferent, the scenery on both sides remained the same. Houses with tin roofs fitted askew, gas stations with unchanged prices born not of inflation control but of a deeper cynicism, and barber shops with signs reading "Men Only, No Discrimination," that somehow still never welcomed anyone in a hoodie. Malik didn't need GPS. Even if the town had changed its name, he'd recognize it by how people never looked each other in the eyes longer than 3 seconds, by how fingers always reached for pockets whenever dark skin moved slowly outside the painted lines. Not far from there, at a corner where a gas station had been abandoned since last year's flood, a police cruiser sat parked at a slant, its rear wheel sunken slightly into a drainage ditch. Brent Lasker sat inside, left hand holding a paper cup of coffee, right arm draped across the wheel, a posture he hadn't changed in 7 years of domestic patrol duty. He wasn't drinking. The coffee had gone cold, but warmth wasn't what kept him alert. What kept him sharp was the feeling of control, of knowing who moved, who stayed, who bowed, and who would never dare come back. On the internal radio, the dispatcher kept repeating a notice about a minor traffic incident to the east, but Lasker didn't take his eyes off the man walking slowly in the light rain. It wasn't that the man looked suspicious, it was because he walked too slowly and carried no umbrella. Lasker had learned that in towns like this, people who walked slowly without glancing around rarely carried guns, but often bore something more dangerous: indifference, and that kind of indifference made his skin crawl. But today, Lasker didn't get out of the car. He didn't want to start something new, not while the footage from the other day still hadn't been deleted from the main system. The black woman, the $600. A throwaway joke caught on camera that he hadn't yet cleared. Lasker always cleaned up well, but lately things had felt off. A technician refused to wipe the logs, citing security audits in progress. A strange note had appeared in the weekly analytics report, flagging Lasker's number of random stops as 3 times the district average, especially targeting individuals over 60 and people of color. Inside the regional patrol office, behind a glass door that bore the slogan, "Protect all justice for every home," a whiteboard hung at the center wall displaying the list of officers commended for community control effectiveness. Lasker's name stood at the top, 3 months in a row. But below his name, in faded red ink, partially erased, was a scribbled line someone had once joked, "Control or check, same difference, just need a reason." No one claimed to have written it. No one fully erased it. It simply faded with time, like so many wrongs hidden behind paperwork, eventually disappearing as if they'd never happened. That afternoon, Lasker was assigned to help direct traffic at the town market, where a church-sponsored event was handing out aid to the elderly and low-income residents. He didn't like going, but he didn't decline. It was a place he often used to increase visibility, a phrase in reports that covered everything from checking wallets, demanding IDs, or simply standing too close to someone for too long to make them feel small. There, Lasker spotted a thin, middle-aged black man wearing a faded denim jacket standing at the bread line. The man had just received a loaf and placed it into his bag. Lasker stepped forward. "Excuse me, can I see your bag?" A phrase that rolled off his tongue like muscle memory. The man, startled, turned around, stammered, I just took my share. "I didn't ask how many loaves you took," Lasker replied. "I asked about the bag." The man looked down and unzipped it. Inside was bread and a prescription medicine packet with his mother's name on it. She had just been discharged from the hospital the day before. A child nearby, around 7 years old, tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, why is that man getting his bag searched while getting food?" The mother pulled her child away without answering, but her glance, cast over her shoulder, sent back a quiet flame. One Lasker had seen many times before, the look of those who no longer feared, but no longer hoped either. It chilled the back of his neck. Not from rain, but because for the first time he wasn't sure if the people around still believed in the uniform he wore. And when Lasker turned to walk away, he didn't see the man still watching him, his eyes not lowered, not flinching, just silent. And because they were silent, they weighed like an unspoken verdict. A few hours later, in the station's break room, Lasker sat across from the mirror, wiping his face with a paper towel that couldn't erase the feeling clinging to his palm. He had once believed he understood the law, understood how to wield it like a machine designed for those who knew exactly when to pull the right lever. But today he began to realize the law might remain unchanged, but the eyes around him were starting to change. Little by little, he picked up the cup of cold coffee from that morning, took a sip and winced. The bitterness clung to his throat like something not meant to be swallowed, but the aftertaste of something fermenting, something he didn't yet have a name for but recognized well, the feeling of losing control. As the sun began to sink beyond the faint red hills on the horizon, the last light of the day never touched the sidewalk for the place where silent footsteps had passed steadily through the years, as if learning to exist without being witnessed. Malik drove through the old neighborhood with eyes that weren't searching for anything in particular, but everything within his view was recorded like battlefield data. He noticed fresh flakes of paint peeling from the barbershop wall, the sign that once said, "We love peace," now only showing the words, "we" and "peace." And most of all, the space in front of the church, where his mother used to sit every Sunday morning, now dust-covered, forgotten, and untouched. He didn't go home right away, not out of fear, but because he needed to see this town from below, the way it always forced some people to look up. He parked near the old park, where kids once played baseball on cracked ground, where he had once bled in a fight no one reported, no one stopped, and no one ever mentioned again. Malik stepped out of the truck and walked alone, unhurried. He wore a gray jacket, no emblem, no badge. His walk bore no arrogance of command, no attempt at concealment. He moved like someone who knew every brick on that road, who had laid them, whose budget they came from, and who had been forgiven for siphoning repair funds to build a new city hall. The first place he stopped was the corner grocery near the bus stop. Inside, the shopkeeper, a Dominican woman once helped by his mother during a refugee transition, recognized Malik the moment she saw his silhouette through the window. She said nothing, simply pulled an envelope from beneath the counter. "An old lady left this. No name, no message." Malik nodded. He took the envelope but did not open it, just placed it in the left breast pocket, where the heart still beat, but in the way it beats in someone long forced to forget it's even there. Then he stepped outside, standing by the curb just as the sun disappeared, and in the gray that shifted from orange to lead, he began to see faces. Not sharply, not distinctly, but as a collective shape of all the people this town had never bothered to name. He walked past the small bar that used to bar black patrons after 8 p.m. The sign with business hours had since been removed, but the eyes from inside still looked out as if the glass was a border between legality and irrelevance. A brown-skinned boy stood outside the door, neither entering nor leaving. Malik bent down and asked, "Why aren't you going home?" The boy replied, "Dad said to stand here until someone walks by who isn't afraid of the police. Then I can go." Malik didn't respond. He simply pulled a slip of paper from his wallet, wrote down a number and handed it over. "If something happens, call this number. But don't call when you're scared. Only call when you think you no longer deserve to be." The boy nodded, didn't ask for his name, but stood a little straighter, as if permitted to do so. From there, Malik moved to the edge of town, where houses were painted with cheap coats, roofs sagged, and power poles leaned crooked. He found a home with black curtains drawn, a place where, at 15, he had once rescued a woman from a jealous, violent assault. That woman now walked with difficulty due to injuries from that day, but when she saw Malik outside, she opened the door without a word. She shared that no one had stepped up when her ex-husband was released after just 4 months. They don't have to kill you. They just need to not show up. Malik didn't comfort her. He simply said, "You know how to speak, but not yet how to write. I'll teach you." Then he handed her a complaint form. Not one from the police, but a document he had drafted himself, legally valid, strategically designed, difficult to reject when paired with evidence. Throughout that night, Malik moved from place to place, not like someone investigating, but like someone reconnecting the cut arteries of a community heart. He said nothing about his mother, didn't mention the letter. He only asked who was the last person stopped on the street for a reason that wasn't written down. Each person gave a name, a story, and a look, and from that he began to sketch the first map. A map of the silent zones where power operated without proclamation. By the time he returned to his truck near dawn, a folded note had been slipped beneath the windshield. "If you are who I think you are, meet me at the old bus terminal at 5 o'clock. No signature, but the handwriting capitalized the first letter of every sentence, a habit common among those trained under military codes. Malik sat in the truck. Didn't head to the meeting spot right away. He looked over the map he had hand-drawn. Red dots marked places where civilians had been stopped without cause. Blue dots marked where public cameras had technical issues. And between them were silent roads where nothing was remembered. Because nothing had been recorded, he folded the map, slid it into his pocket, and in that fleeting moment between night and day, he understood something that needed no proof. This town had never truly known a sunrise. Only people pretending the sky had brightened, just enough to keep living as if justice were waiting at the courthouse door. But Malik didn't need to pretend. He knew the sun didn't rise from the mayor's office or the jury box. The sun, for people like his mother, like the boy outside the bar, like the woman with a maimed arm from a trial that dragged on for 7 years, never shone down on the sidewalk. As darkness pulled back from the sidewalks and the sky turned to blue without sunlight, Malik knew it was time to stop observing and start tracing. He no longer sat still in his truck. He no longer needed another map, another testimonial, to know this wasn't a series of isolated injustices. It was a pattern of nails, fixed into place, forming a tilted crucifix, one arm holding the law, the other the right to stay silent through humiliation. But to break a structure, he had to find the first nail, the starting point of it all, and Malik knew that name well, Brent Lasker. He wasn't the first to lay hands on Malik's mother, but he was the last to be left untouched after doing so. And to be that untouchable, in a system with logs, reports, cameras, internal files, and ethics policies that read like infantry codes, someone had to shield him. Somewhere, Lasker had been permitted to act wrongly without fearing consequence. And that place could only be the military. Malik didn't need to look up records. He remembered. Not because he had met Lasker, but because that name had once appeared in a special list 5 years ago, in a classified report he accessed while serving as a special advisor to the Department of Defense, a list of personnel reassigned due to internal considerations. From combat units to civil administrative programs. Lasker had once been a military police officer, deployed in Iraq between 2009 and 2011, then vanished from combat files only to reappear as a trainee at a state police academy 1 year later, a gap left unexplained. But Malik knew wherever there's a gap, there's something meant to be hidden. He drove to an old address, a garage near the town's southern border, where a rusted metal sign read "Military Vehicles Repaired, Old but Not Betrayed," once jokingly referred to by locals as the only place that accepted both rejected machines and rejected men. The garage owner was Staff Sergeant Kane, a man who once served in the same battalion as Lasker and was discharged after a classified internal hearing. Kane didn't live like a model veteran. He didn't attend reunions, didn't accept posthumous medals, and didn't answer reporters. But he still held on to one thing: memory. And the memory of someone silenced by force didn't rust like tire rims or snap like brake levers. It only sharpened with time. When Malik stepped into the garage, Kane was under an old Jeep, hands soaked in grease, eyes locked on a fluid line. He didn't look up at the sound of footsteps. He just said, "If you came to ask about that bastard, take a seat. If you came to bury the past, turn around." Malik didn't sit. He stood there silently for a moment, then replied, "I didn't come to listen. I came to verify. Kane rolled out from under the vehicle, tossed the wrench aside, wiped his hands on a stained rag, and looked at Malik with eyes that had seen so many bodies they no longer had room for surprise. "You're the one he messed with last." Malik didn't nod, didn't shake his head. He just placed an old printout in front of Kane, a group photo of soldiers standing outside a base in Mosul, with one buzz-cut man standing toward the back, unmistakable in the eyes. Brent Lasker. Kane stared at the photo, then quietly pulled from his pocket an old badge. Tarnished, dull, the insignia of the Military Investigative Service. He held this once, not for long, but long enough to cause something I never forgot. Kane didn't speak long. He didn't have to. He said, "One night, the boy was arrested on suspicion of planting mines. He wouldn't call a translator. I objected. He ordered the interrogation. I refused to stand there. The next day they labeled me mentally unfit for unit coordination. 2 weeks later, I was out of the Army. He entered a transition program." Malik asked, "What happened to the boy?" Kane answered, "Dead, eyes still open. Holding a coin. He said his mother gave it for luck." Then Kane pulled out an old note, wrapped in wrinkled tape. Inside was a photo of the boy's body, eyes wide, hand clenched tight. I kept it, not to accuse, but to remind myself, if I couldn't stop it. Malik took the photo. He didn't tremble, but his grip tightened. In his mind, his mother's letter resurfaced, not an accusation, not a request, just a statement. And that calmness, placed beside Kane's words, rang so deeply through his chest, he felt his ribs tighten with every breath. Malik handed the photo back and said, "I don't need proof. I need to know where he is, who signed his transfer." Kane gave a dry chuckle, not mocking, but like something bitter he'd been waiting to spit out. "Commander's name, Carson Dunn. He's this town's police chief now." Malik nodded, then pulled something small from his pocket and placed it on the bench. A printed resignation form, unsigned, stamped but blank, stating, "Reason, no longer holds faith in the principle of serving the public." Kane looked at the form, then at Malik. "Are you planning to bring the whole system down?" Malik replied, without pause, without wait, "I just want him to read his file and know there are pages never shredded, just waiting to be read." When Malik left Kane's garage, the sky had cleared, revealing a silent sun. Thin, not harsh, but harsh in its way, as if the light itself was trying to confess something no one cared to hear. He didn't turn toward his mother's house, not out of avoidance, but because he needed to set things in order before stepping back into that home, where opening the door alone could let a flood of memories pour in. He drove through the center of town, eyes quietly scanning every blind corner, every camera angle, every dead zone someone like Lasker might choose to strike. Malik didn't need a blueprint or a surveillance layout. He had studied this during urban combat simulation, where every curb could mark the line between life and death, and the wallet that didn't need hiding was the one most dangerous of all. That afternoon, a quiet plan began. No announcement, no warning, no statement. Malik went to the small market at the corner of the square, purchased a cheap leather wallet and a bill of just enough value to draw attention, but not so large it would raise suspicion. He arranged the wallet, slipping the bill into the outer slot, intentionally letting a corner peek out. Then he handed it to an old thin man with a limp, wearing a worn collared shirt and frayed khaki pants. This man had been one of the individuals Malik helped fill out a complaint form the day before, someone with nothing left to lose but time. He was instructed carefully, walk slowly, silently, don't look around, and pass through the area Lasker often patrolled. And if you top, D. Don't react, say nothing, don't beg, just wait. And everything unfolded almost exactly as Malik had envisioned. 4:11 p.m., a white SUV marked with a police logo pulled up just as the old man crossed 3rd Street near the abandoned gas station. Lasker stepped out. No siren, no body cam turned on. His movements were quick, not rushed, but sharp, like a blade. habitual gestures of someone who conducted checks without documentation. He approached, demanding Ed the man open his bag. The man complied. Then Lasker asked to see the wallet, and when he spotted the bill peeking from the outer slot, he didn't question it, just silently pulled it out, flipping it front to back. An instinctive motion. But this time, the back of the bill held a small note, folded, pressed flat, impossible to see under casual handling. Lasker unfolded it and saw the line printed in typewriter's straight letters. "Someone is watching you, and I was trained not to need a court." He looked up. His face changed, not because of the message, but because of how it appeared. No one else had seen it. No one else knew. But someone, somewhere, had touched him the way he touched others. Silently, unexpectedly, with a precision that made skin twitch. Lasker shoved the note into his pocket, returned the wallet, barked a few hollow warnings, and headed back to his car. But he didn't know. At that exact moment, 3 blocks away, in a house equipped with 2 consumer-grade security cameras, Malik was watching the entire incident via wireless relay. An improvised signal hijacked from public Wi-Fi, no one bothered to secure. The 2-minute 30-second video was saved, encrypted, and uploaded to an anonymous server. No release, no threat, just storage. Malik didn't need to go public, he only needed to plant. And the first seed planted was unease. Lasker didn't return directly to the station. He drove in circles, made several calls that left no trace on official systems. The kind of calls people with things to hide always made. Burner switch, number masking, secondary phone lines. What he didn't know, one of the people on the receiving end was a systems technician Malik had once asked to help track internal log data, and within 3 hours, every movement from Lasker that day was compiled into a spreadsheet. Stop location, time of contact, interaction length. Each data point added a line to the calculation Malik was building, not for accusation, but to wait for the right moment to drive in the final nail. Meanwhile, across town, the old man Malik had asked to play the role sat drinking coffee like any other day. But for the first time in years, he felt he had done something he'd forgotten how to do. Stand upright without fear. When a neighbor asked, "Why'd you dare do that?" he just smiled and said, "Because someone once told me I was part of the system. Now I want the system to know I'm still here." Malik said nothing. He didn't need to be present to make an impact. What he did, even quietly, left its mark. Not through speeches, but through acts that forced people to rethink the way they had lived so long without reclaiming what had always been theirs. That night, Lasker returned home restless. He checked the locks twice, turned off the porch lights earlier than usual, drew the curtains shut, and placed his pistol by the bed, a habit needing no justification, but no matter what he did, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. For the first time in his life as an officer, he realized he didn't know who was watching him, where they were, how many they were, or what they wanted. And that uncertainty, for someone like him, accustomed to control, to intimidation, to seeing others lower their gaze, was the bitterest dose. What he didn't know was that this was only the beginning. Just one slip of paper, one wallet with exposed cash, one situation precisely anticipated, but enough to drag his habits of coercion into the open, into a light he could no longer command. As night retreated from the windows like an unseen hand pulling back the curtain to hide what no one dared speak aloud, an odd tension began seeping into the air inside the regional police department. It wasn't triggered by alarms, nor did it echo from the radio, but spread like tear gas soaking into the fibers of a uniform not yet laundered. Brant Lasker arrived at the station earlier than usual, black coffee, no sugar, eyes never resting on anyone longer than 2 seconds. But it was precisely this not looking that made people start looking at him. For a long time he had been the kind of man who moved through rooms without needing permission from anyone's gaze. But today, though he forced his stride, his breath, even his facial expressions to remain unreadable. He could feel it. Something was no longer the same. A few desk officers looked up. Not out of respect, a young officer walking by with a folder in hand stepped slightly aside, not out of fear, but with a look that lingered, as if waiting to see what would explode and when. On the second floor, the internal data systems room was open, as usual, but inside, between server stacks and cables marked with color-coded tape, someone was doing something he hadn't imagined himself doing in 2 years. Reopening the log files of a superior officer. Not under orders, not part of routine review, but because the night before, he had received an anonymous message. Just one line, "You may do nothing, but will your child understand whether your silence was duty or cowardice?" No number, no sender, but enough to make someone who once proudly called himself neutral sit bolt upright in bed and review every clip Lasker had previously flagged as not worth archiving. Then, in what seemed like a harmless video, a random bag check, a wallet search without a report, the technician saw something that made his heart pound, not from fear, but from the sudden realization he had unwittingly been a cog holding together a machine built on injustice. He didn't call a supervisor, didn't send an anonymous tip. He simply saved the extracted footage onto an encrypted drive and titled the file, "I Know, and I Won't Be Silent Anymore." Elsewhere in the department, 3 offices down, an officer recently transferred from another state, his name was Graham, was also beginning to notice cracks in the moral framework he'd once believed in. He used to trust in the ideal of protection, but when he stood beside Lasker during a patrol near the gas station and saw him stop a woman carrying a child, just because she looked out of place, Graham knew his instincts were right. There are things no procedure can excuse. He didn't speak out immediately, but later, in the locker room, when he found his leather bag rummaged through and his training manual marked with red ink underlining the words, "Don't play hero in borrowed armor," he knew someone was warning him for merely thinking differently. And that's why Graham didn't request a transfer. He wrote an incident report in full with witnesses and timestamps, and instead of submitting it through internal channels, he printed 3 copies, sealed them in 3 separate envelopes, and sent them to 3 independent oversight agencies. Oleg, meanwhile, didn't know exactly who had started taking action, but he didn't need to. What he planted didn't require the recipient to know who sent it. It only needed to take root. And once the first root touched the foundation, the tree people thought couldn't be felled would begin cracking from the base. He still made a habit of walking through residential areas in the early morning, not as a scout, but as a quiet reminder. Some things were being remembered, no cameras needed, no forms to fill, just eyes that no longer flinched away. On one such morning, he passed by a public basketball court where teens filmed TikTok videos with their phones propped against poles. A boy, around 14, wearing a torn backpack, looked at Malik and said casually, "You're the guy who was talking to Mr. James near the bus stop the other day, right?" Malik nodded. The boy added, "He said you were a soldier but never carried a gun here, we kids. We've been chased with batons for hitting a police car with a ball." Malik didn't answer, but his eyes paused, just slightly longer than usual. When he left, the boy turned back to his friends and threw the ball, not filming it this time, just playing, without looking over his shoulder. At that same moment, in the office of Police Chief Carson Dunn, the man who had signed Lasker's transfer papers from military police to civilian patrol, a fax from the Federal Office of Personnel Conduct Oversight landed on his desk. Its contents were brief. Preliminary evidence suggests potential misconduct in the coordination of personnel between armed forces and local law enforcement, requesting cooperation for further inquiry. Dunn read it. Didn't furrow his brow, but his fingers tapped the desk, an old reflex of someone calculating their next move. He knew the name in the file, knew the man had returned to town. What unsettled him wasn't the evidence. It was not knowing what Malik would do next. A man like that, not threatening, not suing, not broadcasting, not organizing, was the hardest to anticipate. Because they needed no allies, only truth. And truth, once unhidden, spreads not through slogans, but through the change in the eyes of those who were once afraid. Malik didn't write letters, didn't film videos, didn't post online. But by the end of that day, at least 6 new complaints had been filed at the station, 5 misconduct reports forwarded to higher authorities, and 3 dormant security cameras had their feeds restored, all with no known instigator, only the signatures of those who once kept their heads down. Not anymore. In the dark, it is those who don't speak that give men like Lasker sleepless nights. Because this silence was no longer complicity, it was a warning. No one remembered exactly who first sat beside Malik that afternoon when he laid out folders in front of the old church, using the stone steps as his desk, the tree's shade as his roof, and his very presence as a language needing no translation. But everyone remembered that within 2 hours, that space was no longer just a stone step. It had become a birth table. Not for a movement, not for a campaign, and certainly not for an uprising. All I had to do was make it up just as I saw it. And then I blew it and practically ran out the door, so those testimonies might be torn apart. Malik didn't speak. He held no microphone. He didn't teach anyone how to write a statement. He just sat there, beside a stack of printed papers, forms with basic fields, date, time, description of the incident, names of those involved if remembered, and, most importantly, not requiring full disclosure. At the bottom of each form he added a line, "You don't need to prove you were disrespected. You only need to confirm you stayed silent." That alone was enough to make each sheet of paper into a song. One that hadn't been played, but already echoed in the hearts of those who had lived like the deaf and mute in a crowd for too many years. A single mother with her child walked by, saw Malik sitting quietly, and stopped, not to ask anything. She didn't say, "This is what happened to me." She just asked for a form. After writing, she handed it to him, her voice soft like wind brushing over water. "Can you check my spelling? I wrote too fast. My hand was shaking." Malik nodded. He read, but changed nothing. He handed it back and said, "Your hand trembled, but the words didn't, and even if they did, the truth stands straight." One by one, people came. No noise, no rallying, no slogans. They arrived as if they had heard a melody, unnamed, one no one had sung first. But the tune was already in their blood, their eyes, in every breath that trembled after being asked for ID in a market, after being pulled into a squad car for looking the wrong way, after being held longer at a store even though no alarm had gone off. Malik asked nothing. He just handed out papers, read when requested, and when someone couldn't write, he wrote for them, word for word, no additions, no omissions, as though he were transcribing their song, a song never played, but long remembered. Toward evening, a group of young men showed up, the same ones who used to gather outside the barber shop freestyling street rap, once chased by police for noise disturbance, even though their speakers were never louder than passing trucks. One of them, Molly, had seen that morning the boy outside the basketball court who had spoken of threats for scuffing a patrol car. He brought 3 friends, none older than 20, yet their eyes were older than their years. Malik handed each one a sheet of paper, saying nothing. One hesitated. "What's the point? This'll end up in the trash anyway." Malik didn't smile, didn't argue. He simply placed his hand on the growing stack of nearly 200 forms and said, "It's not for them to read. It's for you to know you didn't keep it buried in your chest." A moment later, the boy sat down, leaned against a lamppost, and wrote. Large letters, brief sentences, no punctuation. But one line made Malik stop and reread. "I don't know if they were wrong, but I know I wasn't wrong to be scared. And I'm tired of being scared every time I breathe too hard." An elderly man with thick glasses, trembling hands had to sit before writing. He handed Malik his report with both hands. It read, In 1993, I was arrested for being mistaken for someone else. They said I skipped bail. I didn't even know what that meant. When they released me, no one apologized. I never asked again. Now I want someone to remember that it happened." Malik read it, then folded the page carefully, like an old letter sealed and sent back through time. By day's end, as the sun dipped behind the church rooftop, no one left in a hurry. They didn't stay because someone was giving a speech, nor because anyone invited them, but because they realized silence was no longer something to endure. It was a foundation to build something longer lasting. Malik gathered each form, filed them into a brown folder, and NC sealed it with clear tape. As he stood, a woman approached and asked, "Where will you take them?" He didn't reply immediately. He just looked at her and said, "The first place someone once told me, no file means nothing happened. I want to give them a file." No applause, no videos. But a boy ran up, grabbed Malik's hand, and slipped him a small folded paper, smudged ink, likely written with a school pen. Malik opened it. One line, "They arrested me once for not paying for chewing gum. They called my mom trash. I don't want to grow up with that in my head." Malik looked at the boy, then nodded, folded the note again, and placed it in a separate pocket in his file, not with the complaints. Bo's house, Chicago's biggest city, not yet sung. Not yet sung, but already remembered. When Malik left the church steps, holding a folder full of memories written in ink that had until now only existed inside people's chests, no one followed, no one waved goodbye. But as he disappeared behind the shadows cast by trees onto the faded red bricks, the eyes that stayed behind didn't linger to watch, but to preserve the presence of something that had just happened without needing a name. Words were spoken but never said aloud. Tears didn't fall from eyes, but they existed. Clear, heavy, and quiet in a way only those who had swallowed tears into their hearts would recognize. A kind of sob, low-pitched, inaudible, yet echoing deep inside. Malik didn't drive home. He turned instead onto the road behind the police department, a neglected path where weeds grew across faded lane lines and security cameras hadn't rotated properly in years. He parked in a shadowed corner, opened his folder and pulled out a section already carefully sorted, complaints in which Lasker's name appeared at least twice, each cross-checked and marked using a private coding system. He wasn't looking for legal evidence. He was searching for a pattern. The habit of someone once trained to analyze behavioral chains of terrorist targets was now being applied to the law enforcement system of his hometown. And the saddest truth was, it didn't take special skills to see the pattern. Every 17 days, at least one unwarranted stop happened in the same area. Of those, 82% involved people of color. 64% were women or individuals over the age of 50, 100% were undocumented, and none had ever been investigated. He paused over one complaint, written in neat slanted handwriting, but marred with cross-outs, as if the writer was caught between accusation and self-doubt. Malik read, "I was stopped at 6:42 in the morning, on my way to work. I wasn't speeding. No broken taillight. They asked where I was coming from. I said home. They told me I didn't match the look of the neighborhood. I said I'd lived here 26 years. They laughed. I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe just to remember that I was laughed at for living in the place I was born." Malik folded it, not into the general stack. He set it aside. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed a number saved under the name Emory Archive Backup. The line picked up on the second ring. A woman's voice, low but steady. "Need me to archive it or amplify it?" Malik replied simply, "Archive in silence." The voice understood. "One day you'll want them all to go live at once." Malik said nothing more. He hung up. Meanwhile, in Police Chief Dunn's office, a new report had just been dropped on his desk, thicker than any in the past 3 years, filled with an unprecedented surge in formal complaints. The in-house legal aide, a former top student at the state law school, carefully flipped through the pages, then murmured. Several of these seemed coordinated, not scattered like individual reports. Dunn leaned back in his chair, fingers laced behind his head, gaze fixed on the ceiling as if searching for a leak to blame. "Can we consolidate them?" he asked. "No, sir," the aide replied. "Some don't just name Lasker, they name the system, and they name you." The room thickened. He sat upright and, for the first time in months, did not feel like the center of command, but the crosspoint of a quietly burning electrical circuit branching across the institution. That evening, in an old coffee shop near the subsidized housing complex, where dim lights and crackling jazz played low, as if afraid to interrupt the silence of regulars, Malik met someone not on his list. A woman in her 30s with short-cropped hair wearing a faded military jacket was writing in a notebook. When Malik ordered black tea, she looked over and nodded slightly. He didn't recognize her at first until she said, "I used to be a Signal Corps specialist of Afghanistan. In year 3, I lost my unit to a botched coordinate relay. The one giving orders that day was Lasker. I don't know how he got the authority, but I do know he told me to stay quiet." Malik didn't press. He simply said, "You can speak now." She replied, "I don't need to speak. I wrote. You'll get my letter. My name is Naomi G. Malik." In his mind, the moment needed no further detail. It had already become a document. And that document didn't need tears, because it carried enough weight to stand without a sob. Lasker, at that very moment, was sitting alone at home. No TV. No overhead light. Only the glow of a desk lamp. At the same desk where he once kept files of persons to monitor, now all burned. But what he couldn't burn was the knocking in his ears. Not real, not present, but clear, as if someone stood at the door, knocking with a hand that bore a long scar. The same scar he'd seen once during his temporary assignment to the Southern Warfront, where a soldier known only as Echo operated. No one in the military dared mention that name. But now, he knew that man was back, and that presence, though they hadn't yet met, was tightening around his neck with the same silence he had once used to keep an entire system beneath his boot. Even with the lights in his house still on, the doors locked, the blinds drawn, and his phone set to Do Not Disturb, Brent Lasker still couldn't sleep. Not because of guilt. Guilt was a luxury reserved for those who still had enough of their humanity intact to be tormented by it. What kept him restless was something else. A sensation he couldn't name, but one that lingered like the ticking of a clock hand tapping wood, never loud enough to warrant covering his ears, but too steady to ignore. He hadn't heard the man's name spoken. He hadn't seen his face. He hadn't received a warning letter. No hard proof of surveillance existed. Yet every action Lasker made that day, every step, every glance over his shoulder, every time his hand reached for his firearm, proved he knew. He knew someone had returned. Someone the system had once tried to erase, once sought to bury by omitting medals, purging photographs, and removing records. But the things the system tried hardest to forget were the very ones men like Lasker could never unremember. That man, Malik Johnson, didn't need to appear. His silence echoed perfectly in the very spaces Lasker once controlled. At the precinct, he noticed the gatekeeper's head dip just slightly slower than usual. On the street, a child looked him in the eye, then turned away, not afraid. In the news, a small blog posted about a soldier returned without a name, accompanied by an old photo. Blurred, lacking detail, but unmistakable in the eyes. That stare, which once made officers far higher in rank than Lasker leave boardrooms as if they'd been stripped bare. And while no one confirmed the photo was of Malik, when Lasker saw it, he didn't ask, "Who?" He asked, "Does he know where I am yet?" Elsewhere, in a small print shop near the old metro line, a middle-aged man quietly ordered 200 black and white A4 flyers. No pictures, no graphics, just 2 lines. The man who saved 14 soldiers from an ambush in 2015. now filing civilian complaints in town. No name printed, but everyone knew. The flyers appeared on bus stops, diner windows, and barbershop walls within 24 hours. Within 36 hours, a YouTube channel specializing in military dossiers released a video titled "Echo 1 is back, and he's not coming for medals." The 7-minute clip, stitched together with archival footage and speculation, featured a grainy civilian cam recording of Malik stepping out of the church, face half in light, half in shadow, a document case strapped to his back, as if he carried an investigative agency instead of a weapon. The video went viral. In the comments, no one asked, "Who is he?" They asked, "When will he speak?" In a world oversaturated with declarations, a man's silence became a paradox that shook those in power. Malik didn't respond, didn't issue a statement, didn't post, and yet people feared his name as though it had already been said too many times. Not by insiders, but by those who once believed no one would care about a black veteran born in a town that even GPS systems struggled to define clearly. Police Chief Dunn, after days of keeping quiet, finally called a closed-door meeting. Mid-level officers were instructed to keep information about the recent complaints confidential, and should journalists inquired, the only approved statement was, "We are reviewing procedures." No one mentioned Malik by name. No one dared, as if speaking it aloud would make him appear. Only Graham, the youngest officer, raised his hand to speak. His first question was, "What are we hiding, if those accusing us aren't hiding themselves?" The question received no reply, but it spread like a hairline crack across a wall long assumed unbreakable in its discipline. Meanwhile, a column appeared in the town's small local paper, an editorial not directly referencing the scandal, but asking, "Do those who enforce the law still believe they deserve its protection when they break it?" The article was unsigned, but seasoned journalists knew it didn't originate from within the newsroom. It came from a temporary email address, military-coded, accompanied by a single sentence. "Let them answer with actions, not press briefings." One veteran editor, upon reading it, muttered, "The way he turns this place into a battlefield. Classic Delta." On the other side of the city, Malik sat alone in a small rented room above a pharmacy. The room was unremarkable. No decoration but a wall plastered with a map of movements, not of operations or raids, but of emotion, pinpointing the fractures in communal trust, the sites where people were stripped of the right to even react. He pinned up quotes, not evidence, snippets of behavior, not footage, things that couldn't stand in court but could sketch the outline of a system fueled by the silence of its victims. He said nothing, but those who had met him began speaking in his stead. A child told their teacher, "I don't want to learn about Martin Luther King, I want to learn about the man who gave me a pen yesterday." A woman handed her complaint directly to the city council chairperson and said, "If she doesn't show up here next week, I'll say it in public." The chairperson asked, "Who's she?" The woman replied, "The mother of the man you're trying not to name." And across town, something shifted. No one shouted anymore, but everyone listened. And in that hush, Malik no longer needed to say a word. His name, though not engraved on any plaque, now lived in the minds of those who once believed themselves the center of authority, not as a man, but as a mirror. The more they avoided it, the clearer they saw how low they had bowed. In the darkness of a rented room with no nameplate on the door, Malik sat facing himself through the dusty glass window, not to admire nor to reminisce, but simply to confirm something he'd reminded himself of for years. That silence does not make a person disappear, but if one is not careful, it can make them forget who they are. The outside world kept turning. Numbers kept jumping across screens. Powerful faces kept speaking in the same monotonous tone. News kept updating incidents that seemed unrelated, but Malik knew better. Not everyone who knows their name knows what they've lost. And not everyone who loses something ever gets the chance to look at it as clearly as when he read the final line of a leaked internal report where his name had been redacted, yet the traces remained. unmistakably his. That file didn't come from an official source. It was pushed through the door slit at midnight in a nameless envelope. No seal, no note. Inside was a copy of an internal memo between two senior commanding officers from more than 10 years ago, recording the reason for reassignment. Johnson, Malik, lacks adaptability in tactical coordination under directive. There was no evidence of insubordination, no operational error, no field mishap, just a dry note, incompatible with strategic team orientation. Malik read it, then set it down. He didn't get angry. He didn't leap to his feet. He simply closed his eyes for a few minutes, as if testing whether by erasing that line from memory, he would still be himself. And he knew he did not regret being dismissed, only regretted ever believing that was the price to preserve the last of his humanity. When morning came, Malik stepped outside. He didn't change his route, brought nothing but a single printed page. Not the file, but a statement from another soldier who had once served in the same unit. This person did not reveal their name, signing only with an old code name, Gray Fox Unit 7. The statement recounted a classified operation, where a direct order from command forced the entire squad to abandon 3 civilians in a village under artillery fire. Malik had disobeyed. He carried a little girl out from the rubble, back toward the extraction point, delaying the team's retreat by 12 minutes, an action later recorded in his file as a disruptive, prioritized combat sequencing. But Gray Fox wrote, "If not for those 12 minutes, I would have spent the rest of my life believing I was nothing more than a tool." Malik read it, folded the statement, and placed it back in the envelope. He didn't send it, he simply kept it. That afternoon, he went to the former city hall, now a community center held together by residents. No sign, no funding, no administrative staff, just a whiteboard hanging in the center of the room with a bold marker line, "You don't have to be right to deserve to be heard." Malik placed the second file on the desk, complaints he had categorized into 3 groups: procedural violations, bias-driven abuse of power, and neglect of consequences. He didn't tell anyone he'd sorted them this way. But those who came after, seeing the structure, understood. They knew which category to place their names in. They no longer wrote with trembling hands. They wrote directly and signed with their real names. An older man with silver hair and a worn-out suit approached Malik as he adjusted the stacks of documents. He asked, "Do you ever regret it? Not staying in the military to rise further?" Malik looked at him, didn't answer immediately, then gave a slight nod. "Yes, but not because I wanted to climb higher. Because I once believed that if I stayed, I might change the system from within." The old man didn't smile. He simply said slowly, "Changing it from the inside isn't easy, especially when the inside never made room for people like you." Malik didn't reply, but his eyes showed. He had known this for a long time. Only now did he feel calm enough to accept it, without twisting his own heart one more time. That night, when he returned to his room, another envelope lay at the doorstep. This time it wasn't documents, just a small handwritten note. "They're preparing a counterattack. They won't come for you, but for those who once stood beside you." Malik read it, then burned it. Not out of fear, but because he understood. Every warning carries truth, but not every warning needs to be kept to know where you're headed. Some things are meant to be known, not to stop you, but so you won't be caught off guard. In the night, he reopened his laptop, for the first time in weeks, logging into a private encrypted system no longer maintained by the government but once used by him to submit after-action reports. This time it wasn't to report. It was to send a data packet to 3 non-governmental organizations, with a subject line, "Voluntary withdrawal from lawful system due to ethical conflict." Misstated conflict, internal documents attached. He didn't expect anyone to respond, but he wanted at least one of the recipients to understand. A man once trained to obey had now chosen to resign, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. Malik no longer needed to know where his name lived in the system, nor did he need anyone to record his actions as part of a justice report, because in the end he understood. Not everyone forgotten by name loses their worth. But what truly causes a person to be lost is when they no longer remember what their name once meant. And for him, the meaning of the name Malik Johnson was never in a military record, never in a feature report, nor on a hero's wall. Lay in this: every time someone was forced into silence but still dared to sign their name on a statement, that name, even if absent, had already taken form, like a breeze that doesn't need to roar but still makes those who once built their homes on sand shudder in fear. The next morning, as sunlight spilled over the stone steps of the state capitol building, as if trying to sweep away the dust of meetings that had never brought anything new, Malik stood at the edge of the courtyard, holding a metal-clipped dossier, not stamped, not bound in anything ceremonial. But each page within it was a slice of someone's life, pushed to the bottom by a man named Brent Lasker, and the system that protected him. No one accompanied Malik. No door was opened for him. But that didn't matter. He hadn't come to demand to be heard. He had come so no one could say, "We didn't know." That morning's hearing room held no national flag, no press presence. Only 8 members of the State Ethics Council, an old round table with built-in microphones, a few glasses of water and name tags stuck to the tabletop, none of which were occupied according to their assigned seats. When his name was called, Malik stepped in without an attorney, without a prepared speech, and with a bowed greeting. He simply stood for a moment before placing the dossier in the center of the table, opened the first page, and spoke in a steady tone, not raised, not lowered. "I'm not here to accuse. I'm here to confirm." The air in the room stalled, not because the statement carried the weight of a rousing declaration, but because it sliced through every pre-written defense already loaded in their minds. One female council member, in her early 50s, wearing gold-rimmed glasses, sat upright, pen poised to take notes. But when Malik turned to page 2 and began reading from the 11th complaint, her hand stopped. It contained a line from a man who wrote, "I don't recall his face clearly, but I remember exactly how it felt to be stopped in the street, as if I were a walking mistake, and he was licensed to correct it at any cost." Malik didn't emphasize the words. He didn't need to. He moved from one document to another, with no commentary, no vocal rise. But every line he read was like a small blade slicing into the thick hide of complacency. One council member, a former prosecutor known for his sharpness, interrupted during the 8th excerpt. "Do you have verifiable proof for these statements?" Malik didn't look at him. He simply handed over a copy of patrol schedule data and GPS positioning from Lasker's cruiser, matching nearly exactly with over 60% of the complaint incidents. The document bore no classified seal, but the clarity, the brevity, the lack of embellishment rendered everyone speechless. Then he stopped, not because the data had run out, but because he knew that the next step wasn't to keep reading. It was to let silence finish the job. He looked up, eyes meeting each person, not to provoke, but to let them witness that the gaze of someone who has endured without bowing is not the same as the glare of someone demanding justice through threats. He spoke slowly. "I'm not standing here because I was insulted. I'm standing here because my mother was once treated like a wallet you can search without asking. And if there hadn't been a camera that day, this entire system would have labeled her as oversensitive." A long silence followed. No one dared cough. No one turned a page. Then an older man with silver hair and a smoker's hoarse voice spoke. "I once wrote an essay supporting the idea that veterans transitioning into police roles was an ideal model. I'm not so sure anymore. You don't have to answer me, but do you believe you are proof that this model failed?" Malik responded without hesitation. "I'm not proof. I'm the consequence of no one checking when the model was first activated." The words weren't harsh. They didn't threaten, but they left the room, unable to speak another word. After the hearing, Malik didn't stay. He left before any conclusion was read, before any official record was signed, and long before anyone stepped out to tell the press, "We're listening." He didn't need them to listen. He needed them to remember. And the truth is, from that morning onward, every time a member of that council signed a document relating to the ethics of law enforcement, they remembered his eyes. Not angry, not pleading, not demanding, but the kind that made them feel watched in a way no camera could ever record. That evening, at a small diner near the black neighborhood, a place that had once been ID checked over 20 times in 2 months, the owner nailed a wooden plaque beside the register, carved with the words, "Justice doesn't need to shout. It just needs not to blink." Customers didn't ask where the quote came from, but each paused for a few seconds before paying, and for the first time in years, the owner didn't feel the need to install another camera, because he knew someone out there was making those who once believed no one was watching feel afraid, even when unseen. After the hearing, Malik didn't return straight to the boarding house. He walked westward through the city, toward what used to be an industrial zone, now reduced to rusted steel frames and stained walls bearing remnants of old advertisements. Places like these had no reason to appear on tourist maps, nor were they included in any redevelopment plans, and that was precisely why they remained unwatched. It was the only place Malik could stand in a vast open space without being questioned for existing, where no one chased him away, no one interrogated him, and no one apologized for having forgotten he was ever there. He stopped in front of a wall defaced with graffiti, sprayed in crooked lines with the words, "Ain't no justice in memory loss," like a wrinkle carved into earth trampled by too many boots. Malik placed his hand on the words, didn't wipe them off, didn't repaint, didn't add more, because he understood that sometimes the things that linger the longest are those no one thought were worth preserving. Being forgotten doesn't mean something has no value. Some things were left behind simply because they were too heavy to carry without wounding the person who bore them. That evening, when Malik returned, he found a small package at his door. No sender. Inside was a broken medal, the kind awarded for non-combat distinguished service, along with a slip of paper. "I used to serve under you. They told me to send this back because you're no longer in the system. But I couldn't, because if I can still look in the mirror today, it's thanks to the back you once put in front of me." Malik folded the note and tucked it into his oldest notebook, the one he'd carried since his days at the barracks, a notebook whose pages had faded nearly to nothing, except the final one, which had never been written on. He used to think he'd saved that page for the final victory. Now he knew, no victory is worth recording in words. Only the moments you didn't collapse while no one was watching. In a small eatery in the southern part of the city, where Malik had once taken his mother for her birthday in 2011, the last time before she was diagnosed with early memory loss, the owner, a Nigerian man who had once been a military cook, recognized him by his walk. He didn't greet him. He didn't ask questions. Just placed a plate of grilled chicken rice on the table, then quietly said, "The old lady sat right there that year. She told me, even if my son disappears from this world, I'll still know he made somewhere better, even if only for a few minutes." Malik looked up. He didn't remember his mother saying that. Maybe she'd told it to someone else. Maybe he was out getting the car. But he knew she had thought that, and that made the dish in front of him, simple as it was, the first thing to tighten his throat since he returned to town. Elsewhere, in the city, in a volunteer classroom for seniors, an elderly woman began writing in her journal again, for the first time in nearly 20 years. The first line she wrote was, "I once thought I had nothing left to write, but today I saw someone carry worth in things long forgotten." No one read that journal but her. But what mattered wasn't who would read it. It was that she believed again the things she wrote had weight. And Mao, though he never knew, was the one who had rekindled that belief simply by existing without asking to be seen. A few days later, an unscheduled internal meeting was held at the city's police department. Its original purpose was to review crisis response procedures regarding media fallout, but when mid-level officers began speaking, the meeting turned into a chain confession. One said, "I once signed a false report. Just once," another admitted. "I stayed silent when I knew a colleague was misusing authority." No one mentioned Malik's name, but everyone knew whose presence had caused the room that day to fall so quiet you could hear a glass tap against the table when a young officer slid his resignation badge across the surface. No one was fired that day. No one was arrested. But many didn't sleep that night. Not out of fear of losing their jobs, but because, for the first time, they examined their roles not through the lens of duty, but through a question: if my name were erased from the records tomorrow, would I still matter? Malik didn't attend that meeting. He didn't need a report. He simply sat and wrote by hand on the inside cover of his unfinished notebook. Not everyone forgotten is a loser. Some are remembered only because they once made those used to bowing their heads look up, even if just once. When the final line of the encrypted report was sent, without any confirmation of receipt, Malik no longer cared who might read it, whether it would sit forgotten in an anonymous folder or become evidence in a federal hearing. He only knew this: some truths don't need to be believed right away. They only need to exist long enough in the light for those who lived in the dark to blink. And that light had begun to shine directly into a place long considered an untouchable fortress, the state police headquarters. Police Chief Carson Dunn was summoned to a hearing within 3 days after a series of leaked internal documents triggered simultaneous investigations by the press, independent oversight bodies, and government watchdogs. Files once considered top secret, footage previously marked as not worth keeping, and internal memos erased before completion all began to surface like silt stirred from the riverbed. Among the names repeated most, Brent Lasker's became the darkest stain, no longer an officer but a symbol of a structure that accepted wrongs just to preserve peace. The hearing room held none of the usual red carpet power. Only cold white lights and rows of chairs were set up like a public trial without a judge. Media access was limited, but human rights monitoring networks buzzed louder than ever. Dunn sat across from 6 investigative panel members, each with a folder, each question not about what you didn't know, but why did you let it stand? Every gaze turned to him not because of his title, but because of the silence he kept, and the growing presence of the man he had once signed a transfer order for, Malik Johnson. Midway through the hearing, an internal recording was played, Lasker's voice mocking how checking old black women's bags is the easiest excuse. From the back row, a man stood. It was Officer Raiden Morath, 38 years of service, 15 of them spent training Lasker, and once a figure of complete trust to Dunn. Moore didn't wait for permission. He walked to the front, removed his hat, and placed it gently on the hearing table, his voice low but resonant. "I won't let this badge die with my self-respect." Then he turned and walked out. No glance back, no applause, no resistance. But from that moment on, the hearing was no longer an internal review. It had become an indictment. Within 72 hours, 3 independent oversight bodies affiliated with the state enforcement network submitted resignation letters. No lengthy statements, just a single shared line: "We cannot continue to oversee something we helped build." One was the head of internal process analysis, another the regional ethics supervisor, the third a legal advisor to the disciplinary council. Collapse didn't come with a bang, but through cracks no one wanted to conceal anymore. The Lasker files began being analyzed publicly. An independent investigative journalism group reconstructed 32 undocumented stop and searches, 18 cases with video footage marked "internal review only" that then disappeared. One interview with a video archivist revealed, "I once asked why that footage had to be deleted. They said, because there was nothing worth keeping." But I knew, because there was nothing worth keeping, that's exactly why it was dangerous. Malik never appeared. Yet everyone who had encountered him began to say, somehow, his silence had become a language that forced others to reevaluate themselves. Under both external and internal pressure, Carson Dunn could no longer maintain composure. In a fleeting moment during the third session, he placed his hand on the table, slowly removed the badge from his chest, and stared at it for a long time. No one knew what he intended, but he slipped it into his pocket and didn't put it back on. That day's internal audio captured only a quiet sentence he muttered to himself. Sometimes I think we built our whole careers on things never really verified. Crosstown, where sunlight was piercing the early mist, Malik walked steadily along the old sidewalk. No briefcase in hand, no phone in sight. But he knew. Each step now was no longer just his own. They were consequence and beginning, not of a movement, but of individuals whose voices were once silenced, now reclaiming their names in ways no one could stop. Some words are written not to be forgiven, but simply to be repeated. A late effort to convince oneself. At least I did something. But apologies, when spoken after a sequence of systemic harm, cease to be a bridge. They become a fence. A fence that keeps the offender from falling too deep into guilt, but not high enough to lift the wounded out of the darkness that has long since crusted over. And when Brent Lasker knocked on the door of the modest apartment where Malik was temporarily living, he carried no warrant, wore no uniform, bore no weapon, only 2 empty hands and a phrase he had likely rehearsed many times. I came to apologize. Malik wasn't surprised to see him. He didn't rise. He didn't invite him in. He simply looked up for a second, just long enough not to be ruined, then returned to the paper he had been marking on a local incident map. Lasker stood at the threshold like a man uncertain whether he belonged in the frame Malik was quietly sketching. No one spoke, but it was the silence itself that made the former enforcer feel more hollow than a man who had just lost his name. The small room, where Malik usually worked in the early morning, was quiet enough to hear the scratch of pen against paper. But now Lasker's slow breathing rang out like a penitential rhythm echoing through an abandoned chapel. Not because the room had grown more echoic, but because Lasker had entered it carrying a different kind of weight. Not the weight of authority, but of something he could no longer cut away from himself. I was wrong, he said, his voice no longer laced with power, but so soft it was as if even he didn't believe his words could carry beyond the doorstep. I'm not saying I was forced, but I thought if it wasn't me, it would be someone else. And if I went easier, maybe I could protect someone. Lalik still said nothing. He simply set the pen down, folded the map, and crossed his arms. Not defensively, but as if waiting to see what the man before him would do next. Lasker glanced around. The empty chair opposite, the unmarked bookshelf, then the old radio on the shelf, still faintly stained from the day Malik had wiped it down with a damp cloth but hadn't scrubbed hard enough to erase. I used to laugh when people called you the silent one with weight. I thought you were just avoiding confrontation. But when I saw her, I realized it wasn't evasion. It was a silent indictment I never had the guts to face. Malik didn't respond, but the way he tilted his head slightly held a kind of unspoken interrogation. Lasker continued, I'm not here to ask for your forgiveness. I know that's not mine to have. He breathed slowly, eyes drifting toward the space behind Malik, where a photograph of his mother sat, her smile bright, arms cradling a small bouquet, taken the very afternoon before she was stopped in the street. I saw her, he whispered. She didn't scream, didn't cry, just looked, and that look has followed me ever since. A gentle breeze passed through the narrow window, carrying the sound of children playing ball outside. Lasker blinked. That sound didn't bring comfort, but instead exposed the stark contrast between life outside and the slow dying of conscience within him. Last week, a kid walked past my cruiser. He looked at me and said to his mom, Isn't that the man who made the old guy cry? I don't know who the kid was, but I knew I'm being recognized by the things I thought were long gone." Malik leaned back in his chair, eyes neither angry nor sympathetic, only probing, peeling away each layer of a confession. "You came here," he said slowly, voice low, "to lighten your burden, or to return a piece of what was taken?" The question didn't need an answer. The asker already knew, and the one being asked didn't dare to speak the truth. "Do you know," Malik said next, "blood, when dried, no longer carries a readable DNA profile. But the stain remains, soaked into soil, clinging to paper, seeping into memory. An apology doesn't wipe away dried blood. It only gives the speaker the illusion that something was done." Lasker bowed his head. "I know, but I don't know what else to do." Outside, a pushcart dropped a plastic bin onto the sidewalk, creating a sharp clatter. Malik didn't flinch, but Lasker startled, as if the instincts of a man once in command had been rewired by the sounds no longer signaling authority. Malik smiled faintly, not in sarcasm, but the smile of someone who no longer expected anything. "You should have thought about that before you acted, when there was still time not to act. It doesn't matter who pressured you, who looked away, who approved. What matters is this: no one forced you to lean over an old woman's purse like you were cracking open an empty vault." The air thickened. Lasker pulled a photograph from his jacket. It was a still from body cam footage showing Mabel standing in the street, hands clutching her bag, eyes not afraid, not furious, but pained, like someone who had endured too much to still expect to be defended. "I brought this to return," he said. Malik didn't take it. "I've seen the original," he replied, "and I don't need a copy from the hands of the man who made it necessary." Lasker nodded. No justification, no passing of blame, just one step back, then a quiet admission. "I don't expect forgiveness, but if there's anything I should hear to start making things right, please tell me." Malik stood up. He didn't approach, gave no signal, just said, "You don't need to know what to fix. You just need not to repeat it. Not with anyone, not anywhere, not under any excuse. And most importantly, never let anyone believe that doing wrong and saying sorry is enough. Because some things, once spilled on the ground, are gone for good." Lasker left, didn't look back, didn't rush. The door didn't slam, but its closing echo lingered longer than usual, as if a farewell had stretched itself out just enough to remind the one left behind that some endings must be listened to carefully to avoid being repeated in another form. That night, Malik reopened his files and marked a new symbol next to the cases already reviewed. Silence broken, not to categorize, but to record this truth. The one who caused the harm might eventually speak, but a system only begins to change when no one else stays silent ever again. When a man who knows precisely where every cut on the human body hurts most chooses not to draw his blade, it's not because he's weak. It's because he's gone far enough to understand that sometimes not striking back is the only way not to become a more skilled replica of what he once stood against. Malik knew that truth intimately, and he didn't need anyone to affirm that his silence was noble. He only needed to know it wasn't helplessness. It was a choice. That morning, when Malik's name came up in a closed-door meeting between senior police advisors and state officials, they no longer called him a threat. They called him an unmanageable variable because he didn't speak out, didn't sue, didn't hold press conferences, but his presence unsettled those accustomed to mapping decisions through power charts. A man, once trained to strike fast and clean, now sipped tea slowly in roadside cafes, jotted notes in a weathered notebook, walked a dog, and showed up quietly in places where his presence weighed more than a declared verdict. The deputy chief of police, a man known for his stern TV appearances, didn't wear his uniform to that meeting for the first time. When asked why, he simply said, "Because yesterday someone asked me who this uniform truly represents." The question hadn't come from a protester or the media, but from his son, a freshman journalism student, over dinner, while watching a replay of an old hearing where Malik had sat silently for 3 hours and still caused 4 council members to resign. The boy had asked softly, "If someone says nothing but makes the whole system flinch, doesn't that mean the system was too weak to begin with?" And the father, for the first time, had no answer. "He demands nothing," an older advisor said, tapping the table. "And it's precisely because he demands nothing that no one knows whether to give or withhold." Another added, "We can't allow this precedent. Others will start to follow." That comment unintentionally confirmed what Malik already knew, that silence, if it comes from the right person at the right moment, can incite more panic than a riot. But Malik never exploited that. He simply let it exist, like a blade never swung, yet close enough to make the other side adjust their stance. Just a week before that meeting, something unexpected happened at Precinct 12. 4 internal staff members simultaneously refused to carry out an emergency directive for a sweep, citing the reason: insufficient time for personal ethical review. The internal memo didn't name Malik, but the first signature belonged to a woman who had once requested a meeting to hear how he stays silent. The act confused upper ranks more than any street protest. It left no trail, no leader, no slogans, no declarations, just a silent spread no one could trace or stop. A major news network, once known for its scathing reports on Malik and now under fire for manipulating language, attempted to invite him on air to clear his name. Malik declined, said nothing, and while they waited for a response, their chief editor, the man behind the headline, "The Silent Soldier Dividing the System," resigned. In a handwritten note to the board, he wrote, "I once believed the only trustworthy voice was the one I controlled. But yesterday, a retired teacher, read me an essay from a 12-year-old student. It said, if silence makes others correct themselves, maybe those who always speak were wrong too long." That sentence was the only reason I stopped defending myself. One day, Malik was invited to speak at a community event. The organizers hoped he'd share something about truth, justice, and his journey. He came quietly, sat in the back row, and listened to each person speak. When his turn came, he stepped on stage. The room held its breath. The mic was on. The cameras pointed. Malik looked around, then said only, "I came to listen," then stepped down. Nothing more. And that refusal to speak made the room fall silent for nearly 2 minutes, longer than any prepared speech ever delivered there. Some called it strategy. Others thought it was arrogance. But to those who'd lived through battles where every word might become a stray bullet, they understood. Silence is sometimes the only way to avoid another kind of massacre, even one carried out in words. Malik had nothing to prove. He had seen enough violence, justified by honor, to know evil doesn't need to shout. It only needs someone to scream back. And when both sides yell, no one hears what's right. One night, a group of reporters came to find him. They said they wanted to tell the story from his side. Malik didn't chase them off. But he didn't open the door either. He simply slid a note beneath it. When every system speaks, the listener will only remember the one who stayed silent. He never appeared in any feature. Yet articles about his quiet refusal spread widely, because in an age where silence is feared as obscurity, deliberate silence becomes its language. A language that makes others uneasy, because it leaves them with no way to strike back. In another instance, when invited to be a witness at a city council hearing where victims of Lasker's misconduct testified against the system, Malik came, sat in the corner, and never asked to speak. But whenever someone's voice trembled, he nodded. No words, no gestures, just a nod, void of drama or spotlight, but enough to make the speaker feel they weren't alone. That nod gave a single mother the courage to recount how her son was arrested at a market, to read aloud the insults an officer hurled, and to sign her statement with the pen Malik had left behind. His wordless presence began to dismantle the barriers the system had long upheld. A former judicial clerk, trembling slightly as he approached the witness stand, suddenly pulled an old recorder from his pocket. He hadn't planned to play it, but when his eyes met Malik's nod, his thumb hit play. The room was filled with overlapping commands and screams from a wrongful arrest. Lasker's voice rang clear. "He doesn't look like he belongs. That's enough." A heavy silence followed. Then a council member pulled a pen from his vest, slammed it on the table, not to take notes, but as if to say, "That's enough." A silver-haired woman standing at the back, initially brought just to observe, stepped forward after half an hour. She didn't wait for permission. "I used to work reception at the town clinic," she began, voice raspy with age. "I once saw them drag a boy out while his mother was on an IV. I didn't say anything then. I thought if I did, I'd lose my job." The room fell still. She paused, looked at Malik, and added, "If someone like you had been sitting here, then maybe I wouldn't have stayed silent." Then she placed an old photo on the witness table. A child in a mother's arms, face frozen in fear. No one asked for her name, but everyone understood that the photo spoke for itself. After the hearing, the system assumed the stories would cool, like every other instance of civil ventilation by recording, filing, promising further review. But a new trend emerged on social media. Citizens recording themselves recounting experiences with the system, tagging them with, "We were silent too." Within 2 days, one video surpassed 4 million views. A black college student sharing how he was searched 3 times in one day on the same street, by 3 different police units. At the end of the clip, instead of a call to action, he simply replayed Malik's slow, steady nod. Then the screen faded to black, leaving only one line. "Someone endured so we'd stop thinking. Silence is enough." No one knew Malik still kept his old military ID in his wallet, but one evening a young officer, who once admired him from training manuals, quietly approached and asked, "If you ever had to choose between speaking up and staying silent to protect someone no one knows, what would you do?" Malik replied, "I wouldn't choose by feeling. I'd choose whatever gives that person a chance not to become me." That answer led the young officer to resign a week later, not out of despair, but because, for the first time, he understood. Strength is not saying the right thing at the right time. It's knowing when not to become the mouthpiece of the very system you're resisting. Malik still walks each morning, still greets elders, still helps people cross the street. He carries no slogans, wears no badges. But at every corner, people have begun to understand someone is present, not to lead, not to overthrow, but to remind them. Silence is not avoidance. It is a choice by someone who once knew the sound of gunfire well enough to never need to fire again. When a note is removed from a piece of music, it doesn't disappear. It leaves a gap that listeners instinctively fill with memory. Silence, in that way, isn't absence. It's architecture, a kind of emphasis that needs no icon. And Malik understood that well, just as he once understood defensive strategy. Sometimes holding a position isn't for attack, but to keep the enemy unsure of what lies behind the space they fear to enter. Malik's silence didn't spread like a manifesto. It seeped into corners by way of its lack of explanation. And because there were no words, it forced those who had long defended with jargon to pause, for the first time, and ask themselves, "If he doesn't speak, why do I still hear him?" In internal meetings where speech had long been reduced to sterile minutes, no one mentioned Malik, but everyone reacted to what he hadn't said. A municipal office worker who once signed off on funding for the community policing team stood silently before the quarterly report and didn't sign. She didn't know why, only that her signature, once a formality, now felt like a stamp on an absence that was no longer harmless. A technician, once responsible for reviewing surveillance logs, began rewatching old footage. not out of protocol, but because something felt missing. That government affairs reporter finished his article but didn't hit send, worried that the silence of the story's central figure was, in itself, more powerful than any headline he could craft. Malik didn't appear in print, but people began to weigh every public statement against his silence, as though each word from those in power had to be measured against the depth of what he withheld. He wasn't rejecting everything, he just didn't enlist. No clubs, no coalitions, no campaigns, and that made him seem like a separate kind of sound, not loud but deep, not widely understood but undeniably felt. The contrast between Malik's quiet and the sharp volume of systemic responses began to yield effects no one foresaw. At a live-streamed community dialogue, a police spokesperson read out a formal pledge to reform the force. As he finished, the audience fell silent, not in agreement, but because a young woman stood and held up a phone, playing the moment Malik silently exited a hearing without a word. The room fell completely still for over 30 seconds. An absence of sound that became the week's most viral clip captioned, "We heard more from the man who said nothing." At a small cafe near the administrative district, a group of young lawyers hosted an impromptu session titled Legal Responses to Ethical Voids. When someone cited Malik as an unspoken symbol, a member, formerly a deputy at the state prosecutor's office, suddenly stood, removed her badge, placed it on the table, and walked out. No one stopped her. The video of that moment spread online with a caption bearing no name, just the words, "Sometimes walking out is a..." On the other side, a former leader of a law enforcement advocacy group wrote an op-ed calling Malik a false idol of passive morality. But the backlash didn't come from Malik. It came from the writer's daughter. A high school student, she penned an open letter to her father. "You taught me about courage, but today I'm learning it from the man who didn't need to speak to protect Mom." Her letter went viral on student forums nationwide, shared by thousands of parents, not for debate, but as a reminder that even innocence knows when belief has been bent too far. At a local university's communications class, the professor posed a challenge. Analyze the media presence of someone who doesn't use media. Over 30 students chose Malik. One called him the antiviral presence. Another wrote, "He doesn't want people to act for him. He wants them to act as if no one's watching, and that's how he makes them accountable." A psychology major noted, "His silence makes me want to speak more truthfully, not more loudly." Malik never read those essays, but when a student volunteer delivered a bound thesis titled Collective Reflex Under Nonverbal Leadership, he opened to one page and underlined the line, "Some lift their communities not by commanding, but by refusing the microphone." That night, sitting on the boarding house rooftop, Malik heard a radio from the apartment below reporting on a review of past law enforcement misconduct being broadened in scope. He didn't turn on the light, didn't respond, but in the dark, his hand traced the map pinned to a wooden frame, where red dots had faded to pale gray, not because wrongdoing had vanished, but because people had begun to fill the void with actions of their own. An elderly man who had never learned to read, after receiving help writing a complaint, began attending the public library no longer to file grievances, but so he wouldn't need someone to read for him next time. A child, once detained for stepping over a crosswalk line, now stood before her class, recounting the experience without shaking. A group of youths who once spoke only through rap lyrics had formed a wall newspaper club, with the first post reading, "We write not because Malik told us to, but because silence no longer fits." Even those who once opposed him, conservative officials, veteran skeptics, began to separate who they were from the titles they held. One older man who had argued against Malik at a town council meeting quietly mailed him a letter. No apology, no praise, just a single line. "I used to think you should speak. Now I think I should stop speaking for lives I haven't lived." Malik's silence, in this way, became a knock on the door that used no hand. It didn't strike the face, didn't pierce the ear, but to those who heard it, it twisted something inside, not out of shame, but recognition. A sound not meant to confront, but to exist. One that made people pause, not turn away, not dismiss, not deflect. Because it wasn't an attack, it was a presence. A sound doesn't need to be loud to shake someone awake. Sometimes, a soft knock at an hour no one expects on the door of a home that once believed itself immune to injustice is more terrifying than any siren. Malik never knocked, but his presence, like a quiet tide on days without breaking news, reached the thresholds of those who once sat behind meeting tables thinking only in figures, signatures, and bureaucratic authority. And then one day, they or someone they loved became a number in someone else's ledger. One late autumn afternoon, as sunlight angled through the windows of the city council building, trying in vain to illuminate corners long left to dust, Nathaniel Franks, head of administrative operations, stood outside Malik's apartment. Not as an official, but as a father. His son, a second-year college student, had just been unlawfully detained by the local police. The reason? Matched the description of a disturbance suspect at a bar, despite the boy not drinking, not reacting, not having any record, and most notably being the only black person in his group that night. Frank hadn't come to apologize, nor to explain. He stood there, then simply said, "Now I understand." Malik didn't ask. Understand what? He just stayed silent, letting the space between them speak for itself. I used to think things like that only happened to someone else, somewhere else. But now it's walked into my house uninvited, unannounced, and took the safety of someone I thought would always be protected by the very system I've served my whole life. Malik said nothing, because he knew awakenings must stay in the mind of the awakened, not be affirmed by others. It wasn't a moment for forgiveness, it was a moment of confrontation. Not with anyone else, but with oneself. At the same time, Elaine Whitmore, a former council member who had vocally opposed every reform proposal, received a midnight call from the hospital. Her husband had been detained too long on the roadside due to a broken tail light. While waiting for identity verification, he suffered a heart attack. Medical help arrived late. In the body cam audio, someone is heard saying, "He's just faking it to dodge a fine." Malik didn't speak when the press dug up old footage of Elaine's speeches, but the ER doctor, an Arab American once denied promotion for lacking political neutrality, wrote on the medical record, "Delay not due to health protocols, due to social conditions." These stories, devoid of slogans, untouched by fundraising campaigns, became unavoidable truths, and Malik, by staying silent, once again emerged in every internal conversation, not as someone to argue with, but as a bell that had rung too many out of their slumber, wrapped in privilege. Last week, a programmer from the State Justice Department quit mid-shift with no explanation, attaching a 46-second clip Malik beneath a leaking awning, removing his jacket to wrap a freezing homeless man while still holding a notebook of misconduct investigations. Footage pulled from a traffic cam. No sensational editing, no subtitles. Within 3 hours, it aired on 3 local channels. His name wasn't mentioned, but everyone knew. People began asking, how does someone without a title or power make those in charge rethink every word they say? In a closed-door session at the state legal office, a sudden disruption occurred. The presiding office, known for prioritizing stability before reform, abruptly left after receiving an unmarked envelope. Inside, a 12-year-old disciplinary report showing he once dismissed a young woman's complaint for lack of societal evidence. No sender. Just a handwritten note, ink slightly blurred. Not everyone silent forgets. The phrase began appearing in restroom stalls, behind meeting room doors, scrawled in pencil on elementary school bulletin boards. 1 week later, at the diner Malik frequented every Saturday, jokingly called the Second City Hall, A waitress was fired for refusing to serve a police officer named in civilian abuse reports. Malik wasn't there, but a customer recorded the exchange. The server simply said, "I won't serve the man who pinned his knee on my mother's neck when she collapsed on the street," just to check car papers. The clip hit over 1 million views in a day. Malik's name wasn't tagged. Yet every comment pointed to a figure no one dared name directly. The chain reaction of reckoning. A newly elected council member, Ra won by pledging to reform the system from within, encountered Malik at a dusty bookstore, his usual Friday stop. She said nothing for 10 minutes, watching him browse. Then, as he checked out, she stepped close and whispered, "I used to wonder why you didn't speak. Now I understand, because you knew one day we'd have to speak for ourselves." Malik didn't smile, didn't praise. He just placed a hand gently on the book in her hand, an old copy of The Price of Neutrality, and walked away. That night, on a live national segment about law enforcement reform, the host veered off script, asking the Interior Ministry spokesperson, "Do you believe the current system is strong enough to survive the silence of a man who needs not speak?" The question wasn't in the notes. The spokesperson paused for 2 seconds, long enough for the internet to clip it, overlay somber music, and caption, "Even silence makes some step back." It went viral overnight. The next morning, during an emergency Department of Internal Affairs meeting, the governor made a brief statement. No one has the right to believe they stand above wrongdoing just because it hasn't reached their doorstep. Press clipped the moment, posted it everywhere. Malik didn't read it. He was at the park, helping a boy learn to ride a bike. Not because he knew him, but because the kid kept falling in front of the boarding house and no one had stopped long enough to steady the handlebars. Distance. When the boy finally pedaled on his own, his mother, hair graying too soon for her age, said, "Thank you. I don't know your name." Malik replied, as he had many before, "You don't need to. Just remember, someday, justice won't come from a courtroom. It'll come from someone who stopped at the right moment." As the last light of day slid across the aging roof tiles of City Hall, Malik stood still at the steps where a hearing once took place without applause. He didn't look around, didn't glance up. He stared straight at the closed door. The same door that once opened to loud declarations, signatures from those who passed through the lives of others, leaving nothing but paperwork behind. A breeze passed, gentle, not cold enough to make anyone shiver, but enough to rustle the notices barely clinging to the bulletin board, where a new line had been pasted the night before. "They're fixing laws, but who fixes the ones who write them?" Malik didn't touch the note, didn't tear it down, didn't strike it through. He let it be, like a piece of the city's structure he once chose to walk away from, and now chose to face, not to speak, but to remain. He turned away, walking toward the bus stop where no one waited, where no bus would come, but where the old wooden bench still stood. He sat, hands resting on his knees, his gaze steady and silent like the shadow stretching from his body across the rain-washed pavement. And then, like a moment planned by coincidence, a girl appeared, wearing a red coat, holding a lunchbox, sitting next to him without a word. After a while, she asked, "Has someone ever wronged you?" The question came as simply as a breath, but its simplicity made it impossible to answer right away. Malik looked into her eyes, not confused, not curious, just genuinely wanting to know. And for the first time in months, Malik didn't think about tactics or messages. He thought of his mother's cheek, where a cop once pressed a finger, ordering her to step back. He thought of the night he came home from deployment, when the white neighbor told his mother, "We thought he was dead." He thought of the first time he held someone else's complaint in his hands trembling, not from fear, but from recognizing truths he'd long buried. "Yes," Malik said, "many times." The girl nodded, as if that wasn't surprising. Then she added, "I don't know what justice means, but if someone like you is still sitting here, then maybe justice doesn't come from paperwork." Malik didn't reply, but in her words he heard what the entire system was trying to find. Not structural reform, but the deeper question. Had we ever understood the meaning behind the signatures we scrawled? That evening, in a small room in a neighborhood once labeled Tier C security risk, a retired government clerk listened to the news on the radio. The announcer read slowly. The Special Investigative Committee recommends abolishing discretionary stop-and-search privileges without probable cause. He didn't cheer, didn't shake his head. He just turned off the radio and looked out the window, where his granddaughter was learning to ride a bike under the amber street lamp, with a tall man behind her, not holding on, eyes fixed, yet never interfering. And the man knew change wasn't coming from policy. It came from those who chose to stop long enough not to look away. At the same time, in a closed high-level meeting at the State Office of Internal Oversight, a report was presented stating, "Shifts in public awareness within previously high complaint zones are beginning to influence internal personnel behavior." Someone asked, "Was the source of influence identified?" The presenter shook his head. No, only that after the events surrounding Mr. Malik Johnson, internal conversations no longer revolve around procedure, but around purpose. But in their eyes, something appeared for the first time that every reform needs. A confusion not born of rebellion, but of self-reflection. The next day, Malik didn't show up at the cafe he usually visited. No one worried. No one called. But someone left a note on the windowside table. "I don't know where you're going, but I know your presence will stay in how I look at people now. No name, no date." But when the cafe owner read it, he pinned it to the board beneath an old yellowed sign that read, "Silence isn't absence. It's just that people haven't learned how to listen in time." Malik left town one morning when no one was watching. He brought no luggage. Just a notebook, the same one whose final page had finally been written. "I don't know if justice is real, but I do know, where no one asks the question, injustice will always be mistaken as normal." He closed the notebook, slipped it into his coat pocket, and boarded a bus with no destination. No one waved. No one saw him off. But in every place he had ever paused, people still glanced around when a quiet man walked by. And each time, that question resurfaced. Not in anyone's mouth, not broadcast on the news, but imprinted in the thoughts of those who once believed they were untouched. Though Malik's story ends here, what he left behind continues to live within us. Not as slogans, but in everyday moments. A gaze that doesn't flinch, a word said at the right time, or simply a silence deep enough to make others reconsider. And if you've stayed with us to this very last moment, maybe you too understand now. Justice doesn't only live in the courtroom, it lives in how we treat one another, every single day. Have you ever experienced injustice? Have you ever stayed silent because you believed no one would listen? Share your thoughts below. Tell us your story, even if it's small. Because sometimes all it takes is one voice for someone else to realize they're not alone. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support us in continuing to tell stories like this. Every action you take helps spread not just content, but a message, a seed of change, quiet yet powerful. And perhaps from here, we'll begin to write the next chapters no system can contain, the chapters of awakening.